For over a century, the world took photographs one way, with Kodak. The name was so synonymous with capturing memories that people didn't just use cameras, they took Kodak moments. But then, like a photograph left in the sun, this once invincible empire faded away. The story of Kodak is not just about a company's collapse. It's about how market dominance can crumble in the blink of a lens shutter. Building an empire on yellow boxes the year was 1888 when George Eastman revolutionized everything. Before him, photography was an art reserved for professionals with complex equipment and darkrooms. Eastman envisioned something radical, making photography accessible to everyone. He created the first mass-market camera and paired it with an advertising slogan that would echo through the entire century. "You press the button, we do the rest." The Kodak Brownie became the world's first consumer camera, selling millions of units. By the early 1900s, Kodak had become more than a company. It was a cultural institution. The brand's reach extended into almost every American household. Families preserved their most precious moments on Kodak film. Photographers depended on Kodak's consistent quality. Professionals trusted the yellow boxes that lined store shelves worldwide. By the 1970s, Kodak's dominance was staggering. The company controlled nearly 90% of the American film market and 85% of camera sales. Its corporate headquarters, the Kodak Tower in Rochester, New York, stood as a monument to its power. With over 140,000 employees and a market value exceeding $28 billion by the mid-1990s, Kodak seemed untouchable. The company appeared to have engineered something rare: permanent prosperity. Wall Street analysts considered Kodak a blue-chip stock that would generate returns for generations. The phrase Kodak moment entered everyday language, describing any scene worth preserving forever. Controlling the industry's future, what made Kodak truly powerful was not just its market position, but its complete control of an ecosystem. Kodak sold the cameras, the film, and the processing services. Photographers had no choice but to buy Kodak film because Kodak had perfected the chemical formulas that made their cameras work best. This wasn't just business dominance. It was a vertical monopoly that Kodak had built methodically over decades. The company invested heavily in research and development, acquiring smaller competitors and patents that cemented its technological edge. Kodak employed some of the world's brightest minds in imaging technology. In fact, the company held over 1,000 patents related to photography and imaging technology. These weren't just legal documents. They were tangible proof of innovation and competitive advantage. Kodak's cultural influence was equally powerful. The company sponsored Olympic ceremonies and major sporting events. It financed photography exhibitions and educational programs worldwide. Photography enthusiasts didn't just use Kodak equipment, they aspired to it. Professional photographers considered Kodak the gold standard. When Kodak advertised, people listened, and they bought what Kodak was selling. The invention that changed everything here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. In 1975, a Kodak engineer named Steve Sasson created something extraordinary: the first digital camera. Inside Kodak's own laboratories, the technology that would reshape photography for the next 50 years was invented. Sasson's digital camera was crude by modern standards, but it worked. He demonstrated it to Kodak's leadership. The message was clear: digital technology would eventually replace film, but Kodak's executives faced a difficult choice. Their entire empire was built on film. Developing and processing film generated enormous profits. The chemical supplies, the paper, the camera bodies, everything was tied to analog photography. Investing heavily in digital technology meant cannibalizing their own profitable business. This fear, rational from a quarterly earnings perspective but catastrophic from a long-term strategic perspective, set Kodak on a path toward decline. When innovation becomes a threat rather than leaning into the future, Kodak retreated into the past. The company downplayed digital technology internally. Engineers who championed digital photography found themselves marginalized. Resources flowed toward protecting the film business rather than developing digital markets. Kodak invested its profits into acquiring chemical companies and other ventures unrelated to imaging, depleting cash that could have accelerated digital innovation. Meanwhile, competitors like Sony, Canon, and Nikon saw digital photography not as a threat but as an opportunity. These companies invested aggressively in digital cameras, improving resolution, battery life, storage capacity, and user experience year after year. They understood something Kodak's leadership couldn't accept. The future belonged to digital, regardless of current profit margins. By the early 2000s, the shift was undeniable. Digital cameras were becoming cheaper, more reliable, and increasingly user-friendly. Smartphones with built-in cameras began proliferating. Consumers could now take unlimited photos at no additional cost and instantly share them on the internet. The entire value proposition of Kodak's film business evaporated. How a giant lost everything. Kodak's response came too late. The company did launch digital cameras, but they arrived after competitors had already established dominant positions. More critically, Kodak's corporate structure made it impossible to respond with the speed and flexibility required. Decision-making was bureaucratic. Different divisions competed for resources. The company's historical focus on preserving existing revenue streams paralyzed its ability to embrace disruption. The early 2000s saw Kodak's financial picture deteriorate rapidly. Profits plummeted. The company accumulated enormous debt while revenues declined year after year. In 2011, Kodak's stock price hit a shocking low of 54 cents per share. The company that had once been a $28 billion powerhouse was now burning through its remaining cash reserves. In January 2012, Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The headlines were brutal. One of America's most iconic companies, a household name that had defined an entire industry, was now reorganizing under bankruptcy protection. The symbolism was devastating. If Kodak could fall, any company could fall. During bankruptcy proceedings, Kodak sold many of its digital imaging patents for approximately $525 million. These were the very patents developed over decades of innovation, the intellectual property that represented the company's technical leadership. They were purchased by a consortium that included Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. These digital giants, not Kodak, would determine the future of imaging technology. The lessons from a shadow Kodak eventually emerged from bankruptcy in 2013, but as a drastically reduced company. The proud empire that employed 140,000 people was now a shadow of itself. The company divested most of its photography business, exiting the consumer camera market entirely. It sold off photo-sharing services and digital camera operations. Modern Kodak focuses on commercial printing, motion picture film, and licensing its brand to other manufacturers. Kodak's downfall was not primarily about technology. Kodak had invented digital photography. The problem was far more profound. A business model that had succeeded for a century became a prison. The company's leadership couldn't imagine a future where Kodak wasn't at the center of photography. The very strengths that had made Kodak great, scale, stability, focus, became liabilities when the world changed. This story echoes across the business landscape. Blockbuster, another entertainment giant, was offered the chance to acquire Netflix for $50 million in $2,000. Blockbuster's executives laughed at the proposal, unable to imagine that streaming could replace their 9,000 video rental stores. By 2010, Blockbuster had filed for bankruptcy, while Netflix became a $300 billion empire. Tower Records dominated music retail with hundreds of stores and midnight hours. Yet digital downloads dismantled its entire business model. The company filed for bankruptcy in 2006. The pattern that repeats these weren't isolated incidents. They represent a pattern. Market leaders become complacent. Success breeds confidence that can tip into arrogance. Established companies prioritize defending current profit streams rather than investing in disruption. The organizational structures and cultures that enabled initial dominance become obstacles to change. By the time leadership recognizes the threat, momentum has shifted irreversibly. The Kodak story teaches something fundamental about business and life. Market dominance is not permanent. Size provides no immunity to disruption. Having the best technology doesn't matter if you can't commercialize it. The companies that thrive are those willing to cannibalize their own business models, to sacrifice current profits for future relevance. George Eastman democratized photography, by making it simple and accessible. He understood that the future belonged to companies that served customer needs better than competitors. A century later, Kodak's leadership failed to remember this principle. They served their own need to protect existing revenue rather than their customers' emerging needs. When you visit a museum today, you might see Kodak cameras displayed as artifacts of a bygone era. The company that made those cameras and defined an industry for generations is now a minor player selling commercial printing services. The yellow boxes that families cherished are gone. The Kodak moment lives on only in nostalgia and business school case studies about what not to do. The rise, power, and fall of Kodak reminds us that no company, regardless of how dominant it seems, is too big to fail. In business and in life, the moment you stop innovating with your customer's future in mind is the moment your own future begins to fade. Kodak took a picture of where it had been and forgot to look at where the world was going. That oversight turned a company that once defined photography into a forgotten giant, remembered not for its achievements but for the lessons of what happens when empires lose sight of change.